Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of Measuring Thinking Rather Than Knowledge with Dr. Jack Naglieri. This is the second segment of my conversation with Dr. Naglieri, so if you haven't already heard the first, head on back and listen to segment 1. We pick up our conversation talking about the history of assessments and how they've changed over the years.
I think what we have in our field of psychology and education as it relates to the intelligence test that we've been using for 100 years. Stanford-Binet was published in 1916. Binet and Simon produced their final test in 1911. So think about that. Wechsler first test 1939. And Wechsler's test was built on the work of the U.S. Army. And that was driven by Arthur Otis, who was Terman's student. See the connectivity?
Mm-hmm.
So we've had that same stuff, and I would argue inaccuracies in what we intended to do. But it's so built into our culture that it's hard to reverse.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody thinks the Wechsler is an intelligence test, and it's some kind of gold standard. And same thing true for the Binet and the other tests that have been so widely used. Everybody knows it. Well, they think they know it. There's a lot of research that's come out in the last 15 years by people who I respect tremendously, who are saying that the way that these tests are being interpreted is not supported by the science, and that the only score that should be used is the total score. In other words, the score that represents general ability. The only test that has been found, which can be interpreted beyond the total score, is my cognitive assessment system. The first and second editions, both of those, because they were built from a theory to begin with. And when we created the questions, the subtests, we created them explicitly to measure different kinds of thinking, strategy use, focus, seeing how things go together, and sequencing.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was recognize the past, but not be constrained by it. Many times authors feel in order to validate their tests, they need to correlate with what has been. Well, that just ensures that you're not going to have anything different. What we did, full well knowing that we were not going to be able to validate the cast by looking at its correlation to the WISC or the Stanford-Binet or the WJ or anything else, we knew that challenge and we took it on anyway because we were going to validate it in different ways.
Yeah.
The first way we validated the PASS theory was we did a huge study on the relationship between PASS and academic achievement. Study was published in the Journal of Ed Psych, really important journal. What did we find? We found that the cognitive assessment system for past processes scores correlated higher with achievement than any of the other tests.
That's fascinating.
There was a recent meta-analysis that came to that same conclusion. Why did it do that? It's because we were measuring more than traditional tests measure. And the real important part is to keep in mind that if you have vocabulary on the WISC and you want to see if that correlates with reading on a reading test, well, you have what we would call criterion contamination because you have the same content in both places. And you shouldn't be surprised if they correlate with each other.
Right.
Think about that.
Yeah.
Well, we don't have that on the CAS. So we can correlate stronger with achievement without having achievement in it than the WISC and the WJ and the Stanford-Binet and so on and so forth.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when you're using the CAS to either identify for gifted education programs or look for learning disabilities, can it be used in similar ways as what people are typically using cognitive assessments for?
Yes, it is. It's used for SLD diagnosis. It's definitely used for twice exceptional students. I did a presentation on that last week. It's going to be useful for instructional planning. A lot of my special ed colleagues use the very brief version. We have a really short 20-minute version for instructional design.
Cool.
Yeah. And for screening kids coming in to see who maybe had a learning disability that wasn't diagnosed in the past. So we can definitely use it to help us understand why a student fails. And I say that again because it's really important. In the past, we've used this ability achievement discrepancy method to determine if a child has a learning disability, which meant the child's smart but can't learn. Now, I remember doing this in the 70s and feeling really uncomfortable when I tell a teacher, well, the student that you asked me to evaluate, yeah, he's pretty smart. She probably knew that already. And he's really struggling with reading. She definitely knew that already. And what am I telling her? Really nothing except what she already knew.
Right.
Right? But with the CAS, what happens is we see the student. We see the student's strengths and where they struggle. And when you sit down with a student and you say, I know it's really hard for you to learn to read because it's really hard for you to work with information in order, and the teacher's trying to get you to learn with phonics. I understand, but I can help you. You give the kids hope. Because listen to what I just said. Telling the students what you found. Wow. Try explaining fluid intelligence to an 11-year-old.
Right. Well, and I feel like it's interesting because when I think about what is a neurodiversity affirming practice, I frequently talk about the importance of self-awareness and being able to talk to people like, here are the things that you do really well. Here's how we can leverage those. Here are the things that are harder for you. And that doesn't mean that you can't do them, but just that it's going to feel like a heavier lift in some ways. And so this is a way to kind of really have some of those conversations in a way that is accessible, not just for kids, but for teachers too, because I think so much of what's out there about intelligence testing is that it's confusing and very abstract.
Right. What can you really tell a teacher to do based upon a WISC?
Maybe processing speed, like if you see,
Don't get me started on that, please.
Okay, I'm starting you on it.
That's the worst score on the WISC is processing speed.
Why?
Because it correlates the least with everything else. So if the kid is high in overall general ability, processing speed is low because it regresses to the mean. And if the student is low in general ability, that means processing speed regresses to the mean up. It's a psychometric anomaly. And I will tell you, I know the man who labeled it. I won't tell you who it was.
Okay.
I asked him, why did you call it that? And his response was, what else is it? And I said, that's not a good answer.
So here's my question for you then.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So I know that there's some research out there specifically about twice exceptional gifted autistic learners. And this is out of the University of Iowa with Megan Foley-Nickpon. I don't know exactly the year for the citation, but they talked about how a lot of gifted autistic individuals on the WISC have a profile that shows very high verbal comprehension scores, composite scores on the WISC, coupled with very low processing speed scores on the WISC. And so I'm just kind of curious how you would, within the understanding of twice exceptional kids and kind of pushing back on that processing speed, like, what does that say to you? Does that mean anything to you, or is it just noise?
In the neuropsychological literature, there is a lot of discussion about processing speed. And you know how you measure it? You give the student something that demands very little thinking, like how many checks you can put on a piece of paper, or tapping, finger tapping.
Yeah.
The coding subtest on the WISC goes back to the Army Beta. Wexler liked it. That's why it appeared in the Wexler Bellevue and all the other Wexler tests. Pearson has been trying to figure out what to do with that damn subtest for a long time. And if you look at the WISC as it's evolved, originally it was 2 verbal and performance. No one really knew what performance was because they didn't know what to call it at that point because it was really Army Alpha and Army Beta. Then there was this funny third factor that came out, arithmetic to span and coding. So then they started to build out the WISC to have those components. And then one of my friends said, well, maybe we should take this third factor and split it into a speed and something else. And it keeps getting fragmented, right? So Pearson's trying to get blood from a stone, looking at tests and deciding what they measure. For example, working memory on the WISC. Why isn't there a validity study in the WISC manual with the original Baddeley and Hitch paradigm to see if the working memory scale on the WISC actually correlates sufficiently with the Baddeley and Hitch paradigm to have that label? It's not there. Why isn't it there? Lots of times when you look at anything, you got to look at what's not there as well as what is. I wrote a review of the WISC-5, and I brought out a lot of these problems. The thing is, we as consumers accept the labels that people put on these scales, and we don't question it enough, and we don't ask for the validity enough. People don't ask the question.
Yeah.
I mean, you've done lots of presentations. The two of us, we've done like a zillion. Do people ever say, well, I like what you just said, but do you have any validity evidence to support that? People don't ask that question, but they should. And so this profile on the WISC for kids with autism, what does it mean? What does it mean? You're using a test that doesn't have the structural integrity that it should have to allow you to interpret that score. And to say it more precisely and more scientifically, if you read the work of Gary Canavay, Marley Watkins, Ryan McGill, and several others, they would say to you that the WISC-5 scores, the separate scores, and the subtests, by the way, do not have enough specific variance after accounting for the total score to be interpretable. Same thing applies for WJ and CHC and cross battery. Same thing applies there. The only exception is PASS. So I would argue that those folks who are doing really nice research on people with autism should be using the CAS instead, because at least then they'll have 4 scores that they can interpret, and they will find cognitive variability in people with autism. And remember, why would people with autism have high verbal score? Well, obviously, lots of times they have a lot of knowledge, right? So there you go. Information, similarities, arithmetic, vocabulary.
Right.
Is that really intelligence? I would argue no. It's what we get out of school and at home, of course.
You mentioned what we get at home. I want to talk just a little bit about the emphasis that you have put throughout your career on assessments in finding equitable assessments. Like one of the big critiques of intelligence testing in general is that it's too influenced by socioeconomic status and background and all of these different pieces. What was it that originally kind of really pushed you? You gave that story about when you first started your career and you were measuring. And do you feel like, are we making progress in this area, educational psychology? And what do you think are some of our next steps that we need to take?
That's a really great question. It's very clear that the history of intelligence testing is, I want to say, soiled by the work of people who created these tests. Terman is a good example, and Cattell and others, Aren't Good Enough, and others who published so many papers and so much work saying that these people are not as smart as those people. And in the early 1900s, keep in mind that tests like the Stanford-Binet were used to identify low intelligence people who would be involuntarily institutionalized and sterilized because they were trying to increase the intelligence of the white population. And it was basically eugenics, you know about this.
Mm-hmm.
And you might know also that American Psychological Association put out an apology to people of color for the horrible things that were done. I read this book, The Offense of Davenport. Have you read that book?
Mm-mm.
It was just so disturbing to read about how horrible a history that we have in this field. And, who do you think were the people who didn't get high scores on the Stanford-Binet? The people who didn't have education. And Binet was right, Terman was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
If we measured intelligence the way Binet said, we wouldn't have had this huge equity problem. But you know what? At that time period, there was a lot of obvious racism. And what happened was that really fueled the white supremacy in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Is those people who published that research. Now, it's really about two things. It's about using knowledge to measure intelligence, and it's also not having a theory, because if you have a theory, then you won't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But here's what happens. I have articles right here by people like Ackerman and Kogat authors who say, well, verbal intelligence tests have validity because they correlate with achievement tests. And my circular reasoning argument comes out. I mean, that's the argument. I mean, I have an article on my desk right here where people say the SAT and the GRE are measures of intelligence.
Mm-hmm. I've heard that.
Can I tell you something? But I don't know if you really should include it, but I'll just tell it to you anyway.
Okay.
All right? My wife, Kathleen, always tells me, you have to tell your story. And I say, I don't want to.
I feel that pain.
When I applied for a PhD program at a university near where I lived on Long Island in New York, at my interview, the head of the school psychology program said to me, we looked at your GRE. We use that as a measure of intelligence. We don't think you're smart enough to get a PhD.
Mm.
That was mild compared to what all other people of color have experienced.
Mm-hmm.
That was trivial compared to, what society has gone through and what we have done to our field. So that's kind of like the backstory, Emily, that drives me here. It just really, it's wrong to think that these tests that are so dependent upon knowledge can be used to evaluate intelligence of people when we have people who don't have opportunities that other people do, people who grow up in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about going to a school that's not very good, but it's if you're growing up in poverty, you don't have the same opportunity to learn that other people have. And it's not right to use an intelligence test that says you're not smart because you can't define these vocabulary words.
Yeah.
In terms of equity, by eliminating knowledge in the measurement of intelligence, we have the potential to increase equity. And by having a theory guiding us, gives us the strength to really look at how equitable this can be, even though we're including more abilities. So I've published in several different places the research that I've done explicitly on this question of equity. So recently, with my two colleagues who worked with me on the Naglieri General Ability Test, we published a book, Understanding and Using the Naglieri General Ability Tests for Equity in Gifted Education. It's a long title, but that's the title. And in that book, we provide a summary of all the research I could find on race and ethnic differences. And when you look at that image, that collection, now I've actually built it out even more. I found a couple more studies and we've created a couple more. It's very clear that the tests that are the most equitable are the cognitive assessment system and the Naglieri General Ability Tests. And the tests that are least equitable are the Otis Lennon, the Stanford-Binet, the WISC-5, the WJ, the Kogat, all those tests that are so heavily laden with knowledge.
It really is a shift in the paradigm, which is not necessarily new. I mean, the original cast came out in like the late 90s, correct?
Right, 97.
Yeah. And so we've got some work to do to get it to catch on still.
I can tell you that it grows and grows every year.
Yeah.
People are starting to wonder, what can we do better? How can we do a better job?
What are some of the ways that we need to consider the PASS processes related to some of the labels or diagnoses that we see in neurodivergence? Or what do we need to take away from this really to better conceptualize neurodivergent people in their brains?
That's a great question. PASS, because it's about brain function, makes perfect sense to be used if you're thinking about neurodiversity, neuroscience, and the diversity there. One of the things that's very important is to ask the question, well, is there really evidence that people differ on these PASS scales? And if there is, would that provide support for the concept of neurodiversity? So I've published now several papers on diversity that shows how people with different diagnoses, ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and so on, differ on PASS, and they do. So that's certainly evidence for neurodiversity. But I've also published on the variability in the original cognitive assessment system and the second edition, looking at, is there cognitive variability in PASS in these standardization samples of thousands of children who represent the U.S. population? And what we find is about 45% of these people, this sample that represents the U.S. population, has variability, strengths and weaknesses. And so I think that neurodiversity is not uncommon in the general population. When it becomes important is when one of those four scales is low enough that it forms a pattern that represents an impairment.
Right.
So I think all of the work on PASS really supports the concept of neurodiversity. Because some people might say, oh, it's, a fad or whatever. I don't think it is. And I don't know any other research out there that would provide the kind of support that the CAST provides for this concept of neurodiversity. In fact, I'm working with my colleague Tulio Otero on a paper that would lay this out and make this connection between PASS and neurodiversity, because I think it would be a really good way of not only strengthening the concept, but also showing that it's real. It is real. And it's going to influence people even if they don't have a disability. And we need to know that.
Yeah. Jack, one of the things that you had shared with me prior to our interview was the ebook about the PASS processes and the CAS intelligence scales. And so we'll provide a link to that for all of our audience members in the show notes so that they can check that out and see some of the other information there. But I know that this has been just a really enlightening episode, both for me and I'm sure for many of our audience members. And I really appreciate your time and expertise.
It was my pleasure. And I look forward to more conversations and expanding and impacting more people and helping more kids.
It really is clear that there is so much more we have to learn and so many more ways we can improve our understanding of how people think, learn, and navigate the world. And by understanding this, better support them in school, work, and life. Questioning the way things have always been done is at the forefront of the neurodiversity movement. And that includes questioning our understanding of intelligence, the intersectionality of identities that influences how neurodivergent traits show up in the world, and what we've always considered best practices in supporting and accommodating neurodivergent kids. Dr. Naglieri's mini-book, PASS Theory of Intelligence and the CAS-2, is free and available for download. You can find the link in the show notes so you can learn more about how to better understand the idea of neurodiversity within the context of brain structure and intelligence. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed part 2 of the conversation with Jack Naglieri. Thanks to him for joining us. And you can check the show notes for links and to check out his mini-book free. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our office manager and social media director is Krista Brown. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.